those words. So this concept of evil and the existence of evil has always been the most serious impediment to religious faith in every religion. It's not just a Jewish problem. And given the enormity of the horror of the Holocaust and or our destructive capabilities that we have symbolized by Hiroshima, it's terrifying in our world today, or certainly 9/11 would be the next level. It takes on all the more power in the kinds of discussions we need to have. No theology at the end of the day in any religion, despite centuries of debate, can ever really justify the mass slaughter of the blameless, the death of a single child, or the seeming randomness with which natural disasters strike. Again, we know of 9/11 and 3,000 people died. We also know that tsunami in Southeast Asia killed 100,000 people. Okay, how do you understand any of that? There doesn't seem to be a theology that can justify that. Nonetheless, there are some segments of the issue of evil that we can try to understand, specifically those where the suffering has caused one human being to another. That's where we're going to start. That's not where we're going to end, but that is where we're going to begin. By creating human beings with free will, God is by necessity, by choice, limiting his range of action. Okay? It is a deliberate choice by God to limit his ability to fix certain things or to prevent certain things by giving human beings free will. It's seen as an act of divine love. Without it, we can't have integrity, we can't grow. But nonetheless, it brings about such things as poverty, war, and suffering all throughout history. It's a double-edged sword. God, we depict God as a caring parent. And so in giving us free will, he pleads with us to do that which is right. He cajoles us. He cautions us. He threatens us. But he stops short of forcing us. Because at that point, there is no free will. All right. And so God has set up a world in which we can make choices, and oftentimes those choices are disastrous. But without it, for the same reason, you need to be able to have free will in order to receive credit for doing things. As I often describe with the kids, if you take an infant and you tie him to a tree and tell him not to cross the street, he gets no credit for not crossing the street. Okay. It didn't have that possibility. All right. So that's the first piece, is we have to recognize that what man does to man, or what people do to people, in a sense, there is no real understanding. It is the consequence of God making the choice to give free will to humanity. All right?
Yes.
Other forms of evil and suffering strike us with a sense of total inadequacy in how we understand them. We want to know why nature is so constructed that it can produce a cancer or AIDS or COVID-19. Not how, but why. Why is nature set up that way? Why does a 7-year-old child suddenly develop a life-threatening disease? Why are some people killed in hurricanes and tidal waves and tornadoes, or in Houston in floods? Why? Why do some people in Houston die of the COVID-19? I just this morning heard of a rabbi from Dallas who was there for many, many years, has been retired. He just died of this virus. Why? Why some, why not others? We don't know. And so the Jewish formulation of the question is, why do the righteous suffer and why do the evil prosper? That's what we struggle with. And so the issue is God's alleged justice. It's called theodicy. How do we understand a just God in a world in which things don't seem just? We are driven. We are absolutely driven with an impulse to pursue theodicy, to understand that justice. It's powerful. We want to understand our world. We want to know that there's an order in the world that makes something in a meaningful way, that the whole makes sense. And the challenge then is two-dimensional. On one level, the problem is intellectual. We want to know in our minds how God's justice can be reconciled with the suffering. We want to know through questions posed by our minds. On a second level, the challenge is more existential. How do we cope with the suffering? How do we go on living in the face of pain? And by and large, no religious tradition has been able to deal with the intellectual issue in a totally acceptable way. We all we struggle, but at the end of the day, almost all responses fall short in some way. But every tradition has come up with ways of experiential coping to helping the sufferer handle the pain. In general, the less adequate our mental explanations, our cognitive explanations, the more valuable our existential resources become. As we understand less, we need better ways of coping, is what that really means. We always start with the Bible. Let's begin with the Bible, all right? The classical, and it's not going to work for you in advance, I'm going to tell you that. The classical explanation for suffering throughout the Bible, with the exception of the book of Job, is that suffering is God's punishment for the sins of the community. Okay? We read the second paragraph of the Shema, which is from Deuteronomy, and it says, if we obey God, we will be blessed. If we rebel, we will be punished by all sorts of suffering, military defeat, exile, plagues, and famine. All right? In later rabbinical literature, this doctrine of divine retribution is captured in our prayers as well, the Musaf service for festivals. And many of us, we don't say this anymore. There's a paragraph that starts at because of our sins, we were banished into exile. So historically, with a biblical lens, we have understood our suffering to be the results of our own behaviors, and it's had an adaptive feature. The adaptive feature is when we suffered, we clung more closely to Jewish tradition, and it enabled Judaism to survive. I'm not sure it's an effective tool in terms of coping, but it has been a survival technique that has worked for us for sure. And exile has been the paradigmatic, specifically Jewish form of suffering. We have been thrown out of the land. That is the suffering. All right. As I told you, it's certainly, first of all, I want to mention again, that is in the collective. It is not in the individual. There's a difference, okay? Sometimes, again, to try to understand this, God's punishment takes the form of a withdrawal of his protective concern, leaving the community vulnerable to all kinds of sufferings. This seems to be the meaning of the often repeated biblical phrase, God's hiding his face, that God withdraws. By and large, the doctrine of retribution works because the Bible applies, as I just said to you a few seconds ago, to the fate of the community, not to individuals. In much of the Bible, the destiny of the individual is submerged into the fate of the community. In a lot of Jewish thinking, the community is the smallest denomination that really matters in the long term. The idea that the individual, this autonomous, what I'm trying to think of the modern term, of individual freedoms and rights is a modern concept. It is not biblical and it was not Jewish for many, many centuries. The individual Israelite who may have been totally virtuous suffers anyway from the famine that God imposes on the community. Famines don't discriminate. All right? This tiny little package of community is shattered by the book of Job. So let's take a look at the book of Job. It introduces two new elements into the picture. First, it highlights the experience and the fate of an individual human being. Okay, that's its first distinction. Second, it breaks completely with the doctrine of suffering as divine retribution. I want you to take a second. Most of us know the story of Job to some extent, and I want you to identify with Job. We, the readers, know from the outset why you're suffering, but you as Job have no idea, and you're never going to find out. You were taught to believe in a just and caring God who is not malicious, who does not toy with his creations, and who inflicts suffering only as retribution for sin. His behavior, God's behavior, is always predictable, and you've conducted your life on the premise that that is true. Okay? Suddenly, chaos breaks loose. Your children are killed. Your possessions are destroyed. You are afflicted head to toe with a severe skin ailment. You sit in mourning on an ash heap, scratching your skin. Your wife protests, blaspheme God, and die. But you can't. And if that's not enough in your face, three friends show up and propound you, that they come to comfort you, but they give you the traditional understanding over and over: suffering is because you must have done something bad. You caused it. All right? But you know from your personal experience that testifies against it. You may have had little sins here and there, but nothing that equates and justifies the fate that you're suffering. Your punishment is out of proportion to any of your sins. That's the Job experience. That's what he is encountering here. All right. So let's look at God's responses to Job in response to his pleas. The speech is, speak to God's power and majesty and the sheer grandeur and complexity of God's creation. And God tells Job, all right, Rosalind, do you have the text? All right. Who has the text? Just raise a hand here. I'm reading. All right. Hold on. All right. Reading number 1 there. All right. Yeah. Rosalind, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I've got, all of a sudden I don't have my thing.
All right. Do you have it in front of you?
I can't.
Do you have reading number 1 in front of you on the screen?
Yes.
All right. Why don't you read reading number 1 for us?
Who are you to try to package me, to try to fit me in your human and moral categories? What kind of a God would I be if you could understand me? I am God and you are a simple human being. What seems to you to be good or evil, just or unjust, purpose or non-purpose, rational or irrational?
Please move it up, Maya, move it up. We
are
can't
simply, are simply your own puny human conceptuations. My reality totally transcends them all. Don't try to account for my behavior.
Okay. What God is saying here, we may not like it, is that the ultimate nature, and by implication, moral order of reality, is beyond human perception. And from this, Job emerges from his experience with a new perspective on both God and on human life. He says, I have heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. And that's not a physical statement. It's a way of having a new insight. Job has acquired some form of new wisdom that emerges from a profound personal experience, possibly the kind of wisdom one can only learn from pain. And that'd be my guess. It's important to note, though, in this response by God, there is no theological character to what he is saying. It is, in fact, an explicit denial of the very possibility of understanding theodicy. Suffering is simply part of God's plan, and it has no further understanding or explanation. Job emerges from this with no new knowledge, with no new facts about God or God's relation to the world. His new, quote, seeing is paradoxically an acknowledgement that he cannot see the ultimate makeup of creation. Only God has that kind of vision. And what ultimately provides Job with a sense of reassurance is that there is some order. Whether or not he can understand it, he's getting from God that there is an order that's out there. And that on some level provides him with a sense of peace. He may not understand the order, but God is saying God does. So that there's some sense of order, and that's what Job walks away from. He wants to live in a world in which at least somebody is making sense of the whole thing. And that is the message when somebody dies. That's exactly the blessing we say. We say, Dayan ha'emet, that God is the true judge. None of us can understand why this just happened. Okay? And that the only way we can cope is to assume that God has made some kind of judgment and that there is an order and there is a wisdom to what has just happened, even if we can't comprehend it. That's the message behind that particular blessing. So far we've looked at the biblical idea of the sins of the community and divine retribution. And now we've looked at the message of Job, which offers a different understanding, and that is simply, we don't know. We can't understand. There's more. Or the lesson would be over. Throughout the Bible, the text is filled with national and universal dimensions of eschatology. In other words, discussions of what will happen at the end of days, particularly post-Torah. It's not Torah, it's in the prophets primarily. It is, with the exception of one verse in Daniel, though, it is totally silent about the fate of the individual human being after death. I've said this to you before, in the Bible itself, death is final. Death marks the end of everything, including a relationship with God. That's the biblical testimony. But as the rabbinic era dawns, this changes radically. As a result of our living in the world of Persia, where they had a dualism, a belief in two gods, but they brought with them a doctrine that was never bought into by Judaism, but there are things that were. Two things became almost dogmatic in Jewish thought. One is the resurrection of the human body at the end of days. Okay? We'll talk about that when we get to the Amidah. The second is the existence and the immortality of the soul. Okay? Until this point, in the Bible, there is no soul. When it uses the word nefesh in the Bible, it's talking about life, a life. A nefesh is a person. Okay? When we get to rabbinic times, by that point, the word has changed. The same word is being used, but now it means an internal soul, something that differentiates itself from the body and exists beyond the life of the body. What that enables is, if our relationship to God is not ended with life here on earth, then the framework is broadened and God has a further opportunity to bring virtue and reward into line. Belief in God's justice, therefore, can remain intact because reward and punishment can happen in the next world. Without the existence of a soul and an afterlife, that is not possible. The special graveside, I mentioned to you, there's a fifth form of Kaddish, Kaddish Le'if Kadata. The graveside Kaddish begins with a paragraph that affirms the entire package of these doctrines and has become normative. The concepts have become normative in Rabbinic Judaism. And they read as this reading number 2. Robert, would you read it for us? Just unmute yourself. There you go.
May his great name be magnified and sanctified in the world that is to be created anew, where he will revive the dead and raise them to eternal life, and will rebuild the city of Jerusalem and establish his temple in the midst, and will uproot all alien worship from the earth and restore the worship of heaven in its place.
Thank you. So clearly, by this text, by rabbinic times when this is being written, there's a belief in an afterlife, eternal life, revive the dead. Both are stated there clearly in the Kaddish that is specific to a funeral. Beyond this, every form of Kaddish, all of them end with the same affirmation, Oseh Shalom. May he who creates Shalom in the heavens create Shalom for us and all Israel. Now, I deliberately didn't use the word peace Because shalom, which is often translated as peace, but that's insufficient. A more accurate description would be harmony, order, chaos. In a sense, the opposite of, not chaos, of cosmos. I apologize. Order, harmony, and cosmos, the exact opposite. Whatever chaos is, shalom is the opposite of that. Included in that is peace, but it's insufficient. Okay? If death represents the eruption of chaos, then we respond by reaffirming the facts of cosmos or harmony and order for some point, if not now, then in some end of days period of time. It all will be understood. It all will make sense to us at some point. All right. Let's try a different angle. So, all right. Our dilemma is clear. Yeah, we're good. That's good, Maya. Good. Our dilemma is clear. If we understand God is omnipotent, God is all-powerful, then by definition, God has to be in some way responsible for evil as well. If God is not responsible for evil, then God is not omnipotent. And then evil exists independently of God's will, and as a result, God's sovereignty is severely impaired. Within normative Jewish theology, monotheism, the idea of one God, was so deeply ingrained that any concept of a dualism is abhorrent. There is no way for a Jew to understand that evil can be the result of an independent reality of its own. That's what this blessing is saying, uvorei et hakol. No matter what struggles that leads us to, we embrace God as the creator of all. There is no competing being out there that can challenge God. Once we establish God's ultimate responsibility, we're left with a problem then. How do you reconcile evil with God's justice and benevolence, with the character of a monotheistic God? At the same time, because this is not going to be easy, okay? God's goodness, so we have God is omnipotent, we know God is omniscient, and God's goodness is so central a tenet of Judaism that when God does not seem to be doing good from our appearance, one can dispense with all sense of propriety and call God to account for what he has done. Okay? You have the story of Abraham at Sodom and Gomorrah depicted as reminding God the meaning of justice in very respectful but very strong terms. Abraham turns to God and says, how can a God of justice destroy the few while punishing the few good people while punishing the wicked? He calls God to account. So we now have a number of different ways so far that we've looked at. One is the biblical view of retribution, divine retribution. Two, the rabbinic doctrine of eschatology, that in the future, there'll be, in some afterlife, things will be resolved. Three, the view that human freedom serves as evidence of God's self-willed limitation. God has chosen to limit himself so that people can have free will. And four, as presented in Job, any attempt to understand this is not possible. Good luck with that. At the end of days, we'll get there, but we don't know what it is. We know there's going to be an order. We simply can't understand it in our lives today. Offer you a fifth. Okay? Finally, we have the recent alternative as addressed by Harold Kushner in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Kushner had a son who died at the age of 14, and he wrote a very personal response in which he ends up countering the traditional inclination to see God as responsible for human suffering. He sees random instances that we encounter daily as manifestations of a leftover chaos that God's creative impulse cannot control. In other words, he reaches, given God's wisdom, God's knowledge, omniscience, God's omnipotence, and God's goodness, he chooses to say the omnipotence is the one that has to suffer here. He does not see God as omnipotent. God does much for us. God cares about us. God is good. God is all-knowing. But at the end of the day, God does not have the power to eliminate evil from the world. It's part of what is known as a limited theology. There's a limitation put on God. Now, as we go forward, I want to point out that if there was an answer, there wouldn't be 5 answers thus far. It's telling you that it is a struggle that we can't 100% resolve. What I'm presenting to you are thus far 5 Jewish approaches to it, all of which have validity. All of them offer us some sense of comfort, and in the whole maybe makes us feel better, because in using all 5 together, we can have some meaning in this process. Okay. Now we're really going to get into play. With the Holocaust, the problem of evil acquires a new urgency. Maimonides gave us a different view. Maimonides provided us the argument that evil should be understood as the absence of good, that there's nothing substantive in evil. We get shadows where light doesn't enter. If there's no light, it's dark. But the darkness has no substance of its own. That would be Maimonides' argument. However, once one starts to look at the idea of the Holocaust and the events of the Holocaust, that level of understanding no longer works. And it doesn't work. It didn't work for Norman Lamb at Yeshiva University. This is not just a conservative Jew speaking to you. This is also modern Orthodoxy and much of Orthodoxy. It's evil of the Holocaust is not something we imagined. It is not merely the absence of good. And so Jewish theological responses to the Holocaust can be grouped into 2 broad classes. All right? You're not going to like the first, but this is one of them. Okay? The first sees the Holocaust as just one more instance of human cruelty, perhaps more massive than ever, but not intrinsically different, and hence not posing significantly new theological or religious challenges. Theologically, the death of 6 million Jews and countless other human beings is not necessarily theologically more problematic than the death of one innocent child. That's one view. The second view sees the Holocaust as completely unprecedented. We have a chidush. We have something new. The sheer scope of the massacre, the malevolence with which it was perpetrated, the machine-like efficiency of the Nazi death camps, the active involvement and the passive acquiescence of countless ordinary human beings, any and all of these factors make the Holocaust and any other genocide since truly unique. In this view, any of the techniques that we've come up with for dealing with human suffering are simply inadequate. Okay? One response that has clearly come out of this is that the biblical view of God's of divine retribution for sin has been thoroughly rejected. In today's world, post-Holocaust, that is intolerable. Okay? There is no level of sin that we could have been guilty of that in some way would result in that level of punishment. So if the Holocaust accomplished anything, it effectively killed the doctrine of retribution, of God's retribution for sin. Other things that emerge from this. The most radical answer is Richard Rubinstein's striking claim that after the Holocaust, we live in a time of the death of God. This was a 1960s response. There was a death of God movement that developed in the 60s early as a Christian theological response to the era's sense of social and religious alienation. The very phrase death of God carries with it Christian resonance. Okay? The Christian God had to die in order to accomplish his preordained mission. His death symbolizes God's identification with humanity and becomes the instrument for vicarious remission of human sins, but it's also understood as an interim step towards the Christian God's ultimate resurrection. So this concept of God dying, it emanates from Christian thought. Rubinstein is very forthright. He uses the phrase the death of God, but he admits that no human being can say that God really died. What has died, according to Rubinstein, is our conception of God, our theological and religious symbols and our myths. He claims that the way in which we conceive of God and his relationship to humanity, and particularly to Israel, no longer works. And so our understanding of God in this model is what dies, and it's inadequate for us to pursue, to go forward. It's another way of saying we don't understand. But the traditional models of God don't work post-Holocaust, is what he was saying. Martin Buber, another contemporary Jewish thinker of the last century, also answers the question of where is God by speaking of an eclipse of God. And it evokes the biblical phrase hiding his face. That's Buber. In the Bible, God's hiding his face is most frequently a form of retribution, but not always. Sometimes it just represents a mysterious ebb in the divine-human relationship that human beings may not be able to understand, but is as palpably real as possible and is terrifying. For Buber, this eclipse represents an inherent stage in the dynamic I-thou relationship that he speaks of. That's his premise of thought. He would say to you that in all relationships, it could be children, it could be spouses, it could be any relationship, there are moments of intimacy and there are moments of withdrawal. That is the norm of human relationships to begin with. And he says that applies to God and humanity as well. Buber understands Job's experience as the eclipse of God and God himself, of God. And he says Job himself is the ultimate existentialist who trusts despite everything that's happened to him. What is significant in this model is not what God says to Job, but that he does speak to Job again. He reinforces the relationship at a later point, and that in speaking, God turns his face to Job once again. It works in certain points. It's hard to deal with the Holocaust for sure. So that leaves us in a difficult situation. The evil is real and God is good. If there's ultimate unity in the universe, it must mean somehow that God is the embracing power of all of this, including the evil. And that's what we come back to with this one verse. This all relates back to the Siddur. That one verse, uvorei et hakol, or in Isaiah, uvorei et hara, the opposite of shalom. And in the end, most theodicies, plain and simply, are inadequate. And that's probably why the book of Job probably was included in the Bible. There was no other answer. It's almost as if our ancestors said, we really don't have a conclusive answer for why human beings are doomed to suffer. So here's another approach. So with that, in a second, I'm going to ask Maya to unmute everybody. And in as orderly a fashion as we can, I'm open for conversation. I can tell you in advance, I don't have perfect answers any more than all the great minds of Jewish history, but we can have the conversation just like they did. All right, so let's unmute everybody.
Amenities.
Right, Robert.
Put amenities.
Since God created everything,
Free healthy shelter, weekly house.
I certainly could understand.
Wait. Hold on, Robert, one second. Everybody else, you need not to speak. All right, there can't be any background noise, so we can't hear the person asking the question. Go ahead.
So, since God created everything, so God created evil, and that's understandable. God created Hitler. God created Pharaoh. God also gave us free will to act on that. And unless our free will is already predetermined by God, we have the free will to overwhelm evil.
Mhm.
The Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years. It didn't. Why? Because we
Right,
defeated Hitler.
right. Ultimately,
And
Hitler
that's
wasn't successful, but 6 million people died. Go ahead.
right. I understand that. But why, just as with this present pandemic, we
Right.
have free will. Why didn't our president recognize this earlier? Why didn't he act earlier to prevent all the deaths? That's free will.
Right.
In other words, the burden is on us. God said that we are the stewards of the earth, not only in issues like climate change, but in health and in all sorts of things. We have the free will to do something.
Right. So again, and I would say to you, yes, we have the free will to respond. That's our ability. But if I'm going to play the theologian, I could say to you, why would God create something like that, like COVID-19, to even exist? Now, that is a very human-centric thinking, because viruses are lives unto themselves, and there is a sense, why would God cause a slaughtering of cows so human beings could eat? Okay? So I'm
I
not
think
saying you're wrong, but it's a human-centric thinking, for sure. Go ahead.
everything in this world and this universe is a matter of balance.
Right.
You have chaos, you have entropy, you have all sorts of things that are happening. You have black holes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, evil is a black hole that draws us in a compelling way into its mass. There are all sorts of balance that have to be mentioned. And I think, God, as much as we pray to God to intervene, he expects us to take action on our own.
Yeah. That is, again, none of this is going to work for everything. In the human piece of it, that is one response for sure. Absolutely valid, good. Anybody else? All right. So, Cyril, did you have your hand up?
No, but I was thinking of something which is unusual. If we are controlling things, where does God come in that? In other words, you mentioned the response of the president or his lack of whatever. So does God have nothing to do with our free will? I mean, is this like he gives us our right to do what we want? But where does he come into this whole equation?
I'm not, look, again, I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to that. You've raised a very valid question. And I certainly don't want to get into the politic of it, because there are people all over the world in different, again, when we turn and we might attribute some blame to the president, we're looking at an American-centric perspective too. All right, it's happening all over the world, and so I want to be broader in the perspective. Leslie, I see your hand. Hold on one second.
Okay.
All right, I don't know the answer to that question. So that you're raising the question of what does free will mean? What are its limits? Does a parent, as a parent, it's the best we can do is make human analogies. When you give your children free will at a certain stage and you send them off out into the world, you can cajole, you can encourage, you can threaten, you can, whatever the words you want to use are, but at the end of the day, you're powerless. That's part of the decision that goes with giving free will. There isn't a way around that. Unless you want to turn your children into automatons who obey everything you say, that is the natural consequence of such a decision. So if it's true of human beings, it's true of God. Look, I'm not going to sit here and try to say to you, I have an answer to the Holocaust. But one of the things Robert said is perhaps at a certain point when things get so horrific, God steps in and says, okay, time out. I can't tell you that's true. I can throw it out as an idea, All right. So it's a great question. All right. Leslie.
The concept of man being a partner with God in the universe. Obviously, man did not help with any creation. He was created by God, and God created everything else. But the idea of the balance of partnership, you know, God needs man and man needs God. And yet there's this evil in the world. Why did God put it there? Is that so that human beings could learn to distinguish between good and bad and then choose free will to do good? But they could also choose free will and do bad. But I don't understand where God doesn't have more balance in the partnership relationship. And then the last thing on the Holocaust of where was man? Why didn't more human beings come forward? And every time they have interviewed the righteous Gentiles, almost without exception, their response was, when asked, well, why did you do this? And hide these Jews on your farm when they've been caught and your whole family killed? And their comment was, it was the right thing to do. Why would that person who wasn't Jewish take on that huge responsibility to save people he didn't know and who were not of his faith?
Well, at least you asked an easy question.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Okay. I'm going to tackle the second half of what you asked first, and then I'll go back. And that is the Holocaust. Please know you're not going to get the ultimate answer because I don't have it. But I'm going to offer you a couple things. The first thing is, why did people stand by? Why did humans make the choice? I would ask the same question of us as Bosnia.
Yes.
As other things happened, okay, there certainly is something about human nature that says, I can't tackle the world. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but clearly it seems to be built into us on certain levels that there's a limit to what we feel we can do. There is a wonderful book called They Thought They Were Free by Milton Mayer. They Thought They Were Free, that analyzes the lives of 9 average German citizens. And he goes through, he absolutely does a brilliant job of describing the psychology of why they would not have gotten involved. They weren't Jews, we're talking about non-Jews. It is a brilliant analysis. Everything from, and I'll just give you a few. On the one hand, the Jews had been, through media, completely labeled as disgusting, all right? When you start to understand people as disgusting, you start to think differently. They are criminals. That's what they were being told. They're criminals. So when you believe there's a criminal element out there, why would you put yourself at risk by getting involved with the police when you believe that they're doing their job to prevent criminals and evil? That's just one argument. It is a brilliant read, and I suggest you take it through. It's something I read in one of my social psychology classes years and years and years ago, and I have used multiple times since. It's a brilliant read. They Thought They Were Free. I will tell you, this is a terrible, funny story. On the cover is a swastika, and I remember driving in Rockland County, New York, wearing a kippah and having this book in my car, and somebody driving past and seeing a swastika and a kippah and being blown away, trying to figure out what's going on. Okay. All right. So I don't know that, one, I can answer why people behaved. I can secondly project out that we did it again with all the other genocides that have happened and continue to happen in the world. Okay. So I don't have an answer, but other than to say to you, it seems to be that there's an element of human nature here because it's continuing. In terms of creation, so the second thing I'll say to you is creation was not a one-time thing. When you say God is fully responsible for all of creation, I agree and I disagree all at once. In terms of initial creation, yes, that's true. But ongoing creation, we have in just a few paragraphs later in the Siddur that we're looking, in this same blessing, In every day, God renews the acts of creation, and we are partners in that process. So when
Okay.
Cyril comes up with a way to save the world medically, because he's brilliant, that brilliance is a gift from God that he is utilizing to be a partner in creation.
Okay.
Okay? In the same way that God gives us wisdom to be destructive. And one can say that's where a Hitler and a Mussolini and a Stalin and whoever else you want to include in the label, that wisdom has been given and they are partners in the creation, but they're using it obviously in very destructive ways.
To create something else, evil.
Right. Right. Thank you, Cyril, for saving the world. Okay.
Can we send you a thank you note?
Yes. Cyril, you have another question? Go ahead.
Just a quick thing. It's kind of an extension of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
We attended your lectures on anti-Semitism. So if we go back,
Mm-hmm.
and just a thought, it's not asking you for an answer, but if we think of all the centuries, the thousands of years of anti-Semitism, it's kind of difficult to believe that we did anything to deserve it, and I have you understand where I'm going with this. Why?
So your argument is that, well, it wasn't necessarily just the Holocaust that completely rejects the divine, the biblical's divine retribution argument. It happened much earlier.
It's 2,000 years. Every place, every time,
Right.
every people, every religion, and we were always killed, marginalized, and whatever.
Right. Right. Well, one of the arguments, if you remember in that course I made, is that throughout history, there's an economic underpinning to almost all anti-Semitism. At the end of the days, there may have been a religious component that was used as an argument, but the elimination of competitors in the economic world is always beneficial to the survivors. When they went into towns during the Inquisition, or during the 10th century, the 11th century, when they went throughout Germany, what in the 10th century, what they did, the first thing they did is they went into the Hall of Records and destroyed all of the records that had any listings of Jewish people who owed the Jews debt. Okay? In so doing, there's an economic benefit to all of it. I'm not suggesting that that's the only reason it happened, but it plays under every action that's happened. All right. Anybody else? I'm looking for hands. By the way, I see my brother. I just want to say hello to Ken. All right. So a lot of you have the picture blocked out, so I certainly am not seeing a hand. Okay. All right. So all we have dealt with today is this one blessing with which we begin the longer blessing of creation, with its creation, revelation, redemption, the three blessings that surround the Shema. All we have dealt with is the three words, uvorei et hakol. God is the creator of everything. Or as I said in Isaiah, it's where its origins are uvorei et hara, who creates the evil or the opposite of whatever shalom is. Light and darkness are contrasted. Shalom and whatever ra is are equally contrasted. It's all we've done today. There's lots more we can go into in this first blessing. I thought we might get through it. We won't. The good news is we have next week. We'll continue on next week with this first blessing before the Shema. We will get into Revelation, and I hope to get into the first paragraph of the Shema as well. No guarantees. Any other questions? All right. So when you are put in the place of theologian, you now have a few tools to work with. All right. Shabbat shalom, everybody, and I really appreciate you being with us.
Shalom.